Welcome back, everyone. We're going to start this afternoon with some discussions of the very important policy perspectives, both from the World Green Building Council and also some initiatives from an expert with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Environment Program, and her own sustainable Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Energy Policy here at Central European University. I wanted to just say the formal list of achievements are on our website, so I'll leave that for now. But what I do want to say is I did attend Copenhagen as part of the World Green Building Council delegation led by my colleague Paul King. And what we saw from the presentation done by Professor Dr. Diana Urge-Vorsatz just was a fantastic concentration of how important buildings are to the next round of climate discussions. So I think when you meet these two individuals and you hear their discussions, you'll feel that you're in very good hands for this tremendous challenge that we have. Also with Paul King, again, his profile is online, but what I would like to say, getting back to some of the earlier comments, when we were founding the Romania Green Building Council, I asked 3 people that were out of the UK, and Paul had been in place for about 1 year, and I said, who is the most influential in the UK about green buildings at this point? Who has been the voice and who's the future? And they said, without a doubt, the future is the UK Green Building Council. So we made sure to invite him here and to really hear his comments as well. So those are my brief introductions. But Diana, if you'd like to join us for your comments. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be able to address this very important set of organizations, the Green Building Councils of the region. What I'd like to talk about today is beyond the business case. Because in the morning you have heard the business case, and I'm just not the right person to represent the business opportunities. Nevertheless, if from this title you would now kind of go into the switching off mode and you would look for the door to escape politely, I'll still encourage you to stay, because I would like to come back to why this global and social perspective is important for your business and for the business councils, for the green business building councils of the region. So first, I'd like to just give you a brief background on the climate change challenge, and then we'll look at the global and regional importance of green buildings in tackling climate change, and I address a little bit both mitigation and adaptation. And then we will talk about why else should we do this? Why else are green buildings good? So what I'll talk about is a free lunch that we are also paid to eat, actually. However, what the problem is that even though there is a lot of free lunch, there is still a cover charge to get into the restaurant to get that free lunch. So we will talk about who will foot the bill, who will pay the cover charge. And finally, I'd like to offer you some perspectives on what I think should be the priorities for green building councils in unlocking these opportunities, and I'll make some recommendations. So, of course, we could spend the whole conference on reviewing the climate change challenge, and many of you, or all of you actually, are aware, but let me just remind you of a couple of facts. So this is, of course, one of the most cited figures from the 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I know is getting under increasing scrutiny, but the fundamental statements and the fundamental conclusions have not been attacked or questioned, and this is one of them. So basically, the point is that what you see on the graph is the time and basically emission scenarios for the next century. And in order, if we want to stabilize climate change, then we need to peak emissions, and emissions will need to decline thereafter. There are different scenarios of basically visions of the world for the next century. And the lower we want to stabilize climate change, the sooner emissions will have to peak. In case we want to limit climate change at about 2 degrees, which we know is the famous target, and this figure is already interesting because there is so much emphasis about higher temperature stabilization, which already reflects that even in 2007, the thinking was quite different as from today. Today, we are not even considering anymore that anything above 2 or even 1.5 degrees is acceptable. But at that time, that was the lowest. Actually, 2 to 2.4 was the lowest we assessed. But even to achieve that, what it means is this blue scenario. This means that basically we'll have to peak emissions within less than 15 years, and then we have to reduce them by 50 to 85% as compared to today's levels by the middle of the century. Now, the bad news is that that was true in 2007, it's still true, but the more we go and the less we do, the more improbable the situation is. So the later we peak the emissions, the more steeply we have to come down with the emissions. At the beginning, if we had peaked emissions, global emissions this year, then we would only have to do about 2% per year in terms of emission reductions. But if we were to wait until like 2025 or 2030, we are talking about annual global emission reductions of around 20 to 30%, which is clearly extremely ambitious. And even worse, what does it mean here? That if we wait too long, we actually have to go to negative emissions. It means that in later years, we actually have to sequester more carbon than we emit. So we could again go on very long about this, but the point is that the challenge is humongous. And it's true that Copenhagen did not solve this challenge yet. There is no global treaty yet that would force us to go for these ambitious reductions. At the same time, perhaps that's why it's even more important to understand how else can we get there, since I'm sure that none of you want to, or most of you are still plan to be around for 1 or 2 more decades, or if perhaps you have children or plan to have children, and clearly you don't want a life for them that would be coming. For example, these are some pictures of average warming. This is one scenario. There are many scenarios. I just picked one, and clearly it's a bit higher than some other scenarios. But nevertheless, it's still very frightening because what it shows that in the region that we are presently, summer warming is going to be much worse than the rest. So when you talk about global average 2 degree centigrade warming, that's actually not the real thing. What you really have to be thinking about is what's happening in the summer, especially in cities. So what this figure shows that, in fact, in much of this region where we are today, we are talking about 8 to 10 degrees centigrade warming in the summer months. And okay, you think you're not going to stick around that long, but it's not going to happen that nothing happens until 2070, and then suddenly from one day to another it is 8 degrees centigrade. Now, even worse, there is global warming, but in fact, we compound that with a lot of local warming. First of all, many of you already are very well aware of the heat island effect. And that is certainly going to make our settlements much worse and much less habitable. And buildings are extremely responsible for this, not only the outer building surface albedos and so on. This is a picture of London, and what this shows is the tremendous concentration of energy being used. Now, the problem is that any energy you use, at the end of the day, it is going to end up as local heat pollution, due to the second law of thermodynamics. So basically, when we are talking about significant warming, it's very important to look at these local small impacts as well. And so this gives a special new importance for very low energy buildings. It's not only about how much will be emitted at the power plant, but it is also important that you use that electricity in the room, because all this lighting in the end will end up as thermal pollution, and also your air conditioning, and in the end of the day will end up as local urban thermal pollution. So the challenge both from the perspective of adaptation, vulnerability, impacts, and mitigation is humongous. So let's think about it a little bit. Let's review what's the role of green buildings in climate change mitigation from a global and regional perspective. And I would be interested in what your guess would be. What percentage of global CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, is emitted from the building sector? And the reason why I'm not going to ask you, because I have many of my students in the audience whom, if it turns out that they don't know this, then they might get into trouble. So, and the second question, which the World Business Council for Sustainable Development asked professionals around the world, was also how much do you think extra does a very high performance building cost? Now let's see what professionals estimated. The professionals thought on average that buildings are responsible for about 19% of global CO2 emissions, whereas in reality it's more between 1/3 and 40%. So in fact, buildings are the single biggest source of our energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. At the same time, the cost premium for high-efficiency buildings, as many examples were presented this morning and yesterday and hopefully today and tomorrow as well, in fact, is much lower. But professionals gave an average of 70%, whereas we know that it doesn't even have to be necessary a price premium if the architects did their job well, and so did the contractors. So there is this huge difference between perception and reality. So we have a very important job to actually take care of certain capacity building. So that's reality. This is from the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, which I had the privilege of leading the buildings-related work in. Basically, buildings are responsible for 1/3 of global energy-related CO2 emissions, and we shouldn't forget about other non-CO2 greenhouse gases, because actually 2/3 of halogenated gases are also emitted in relation to activities in the building sector. So it's not quite all the same what type of insulation we use and so on. So, but let's look at another sad figure, why buildings are especially important in our region, in Eastern Europe. And this is a preliminary figure from the Global Energy Assessment, and we are still working to improve, and my colleagues who are working on this sit also in the audience. But basically, what this figure shows is the specific energy consumption of 3 types of buildings: single-family, multifamily, and commercial and public, in the different world regions. Now, the sad thing is that Eastern Europe is far the highest, together with former Soviet Union, but not highest a little bit, but quite significantly higher. And even if you compare specific energy consumption in the same climate zone or in the same climate type around the world, unfortunately we are finding that, that this can be as much as double of that than in other regions, or perhaps even by several-fold higher. So we have definitely a huge challenge to address the existing building stock. So let's look at how much can, yes, buildings contribute a lot to climate change, but how much can buildings actually help in reducing climate change and addressing? My statement is that there are few sectors which can deliver the magnitude of change that we need. We have been talking about this 50 to 85% or even higher reductions that we need in emission reduction. There isn't really many sectors that can fairly easily, where we know the technologies, when we have them standing around us, that they can deliver this magnitude of change. So, but we know that basically buildings, we can build and retrofit buildings that can achieve 60 to 90% savings as compared to standard practice in all climate zones. So what we've done in the Global Energy Assessment, or what we are doing for the Global Energy Assessment, is trying to quantify that precisely. There has been many estimates earlier how much the buildings can deliver, but the problem is in McKinsey and so on. But the problem is why I don't like many of those studies is that they still consider buildings as sums of components. What if I, do a little bit of fix here, a little bit of fix there, and well, if I done these two things, that's not too cost effective anymore. Let's forget about that. But that's that's not how we think about buildings. Buildings are systems, and we plan and design, especially good buildings, as a whole. So if we look at buildings as a whole, in a holistic perspective, then then let's see what we can achieve. And these are just some examples, very well, that passive buildings can achieve in new about 90% reduction in emissions and energy consumption. However, those are new buildings, and that's the problem, that very often we are too obsessed by only new buildings. And I understand, that's what's more interesting for architects, that's more interesting for the construction industry. But one of the messages that I'd like you to take away from this conference, or at least from me, is that in fact in this region, but in fact for the whole world, or at least the developed world, retrofitting buildings is significantly more important from a sustainability perspective than new buildings. There is very little new stock added to the building stock each year in developed regions, whereas this is this is the opposite in developing countries. Fortunately, the good news is that we can deliver almost the same amount of reduction in retrofit. This is the Solanova example in Dunaújváros, which has been demonstrated that you can achieve about more than 80% reduction with no rocket science, just good planning and state-of-the-art execution and implementation. But this does require, this is not about just sticking a little bit of insulation there and changing a window there, but a holistic approach and a good planning and good execution. So it does require a more sophisticated approach. So what happens if we proliferate this practice? What would happen? What happened if we built only these very high efficiency new buildings, and if we retrofitted all of our building stock to similarly to Solanova? So nothing fancy. Don't look at yet the figure, it may confuse you yet, but basically if we just proliferate this best practice and even allow some learning that the industry needs to learn and architects need to learn, but we don't do anything else, just proliferate what already exists as best practice today on the ground. And this is some final energy consumption scenarios for Eastern European region. Look at the second figure. And this is only heating and cooling energy use, does not include electricity use. So what we see, if we do proliferate these best practices, we can actually reduce final energy consumption by the middle of the century by 60%. And that's only with efficiency. We have not yet modeled if we integrate renewable energy into buildings. That will be the next step we are going to do. And this is against the trend that, in fact, the building stock is expected to increase by about, is expected to at least double, or roughly double, not quite, but almost double during the same period. So we are talking about a significant opportunity. But again, what you see, renovation takes a tremendously important role. So this dark red and yellow are basically the floor space that needs to be renovated by the middle of the century. And this is how much the energy consumption can go down in this floor space. So there is a tremendous opportunity from a climate change perspective. However, the problem is that every opportunity has also a risk. Whenever you have a big responsibility, there are always challenges with it. Now, the problem is that there is a big risk, and right now we are very much taking the risky path. Why? Governments have realized this. Many governments, and Poland has really led the way in Eastern Europe to understand we have a bad building stock, we have to fix it. But many other countries, perhaps all countries in our region, do subsidize and support building retrofits. But let's see what's happening. I'm going to talk about the lock-in effect now. You don't need to understand anything from this figure. But it just shows one selected such subsidy program from the region. It happens to be in Hungary. It happens to be in one particular city, but it doesn't matter. We could take any city. And what this shows that instead of this 80 to 90% savings that we know is possible and we know they do pay back, instead we are talking about reductions that these programs have achieved about 18%, 25, 36%. So basically, instead of the 80, 90%, we are only achieving 20 to 30 to perhaps 40% reductions in energy use. Now, you could say, so what, you know? Then we just do more houses, more buildings, and then we achieve more. Now, that thinking was right in the oil crisis or when energy efficiency started to become as an agenda item or as a paradigm. But unfortunately, it doesn't hold anymore in the era of climate change. Why? If you, instead of the scenario that I've shown you before, this is the scenario that I've shown before, so basically reducing building energy consumption by 60% by the middle of the century. Instead of that, if we continue with these support programs and we do retrofit our buildings in an accelerated way, but we only save 30 to 40% energy, then this is where we are going to end up. Not only that we're not going to reduce emissions, but actually we are going to increase our emissions in Eastern Europe. So instead of reducing to 60%, we are going to increase by 8%, resulting in an approximately almost 70% lock-in risk. So we are locking in these emissions. Why? Once you've retrofitted a building in a complex way, so it's not just, you know, I've taken a little insulation here and there, it's very hard to come back to that building again. Not from a technological perspective, but any of you who have been in the business of trying to persuade perhaps the tenants of a multi-family apartment that they all should sign the contract, they should all get this kind of financing or that, going to the lawyer and then perhaps going through the inconvenience that of, you know, the scaffolding, and perhaps people have to relocate part of the time and so on and so on. There is a lot of hassle. If you include all of this, then the economics of revisiting that building to go for that remaining 30% savings is going to be so bad that instead of that, you will much rather go for either carbon capture and storage or any crazy opportunity, because that will look much more attractive from a climate change perspective. So basically this, because our building stock in Europe hangs around for so long, we have a very high risk of lock-in effect. This means that we locked in about 70% of our energy consumption and probably similar amount in CO2 emissions. We have not yet calculated the CO2 emissions. As you see, we are still working on this, the exact numbers with Andy Butcher, who is sitting in this audience. So that's the lock-in effect, which we don't think about a lot, but in fact, they do have very important policy implications. So, I gave all the bad news. Let's talk a bit more about the good news. So let's talk about the co-benefits. Why else should we do this than just for climate change? Of course, one of the reasons is also money. Well, what is in the era of financial crisis, but especially, I think none of our countries have ever been so rich that wouldn't be the bottom line. You know, how much is it going to cost and what is that we are going to save? And this is the Hungarian model yet, and don't worry, you don't need to write a test as you go out from all the numbers that you see here. What I want to show here, this is so far what we've modeled for Hungary. And this is from the dissertation of Katarina Koritaro, our Ph.D. student. What this shows is the same modeling, that same approach that I've shown you on the East European level, but this is specifically for Hungary. If we retrofit the building stock roughly to passive, this is only for public buildings. If we retrofit the public sector buildings to roughly passive house standard, and we accelerate the rate of retrofit, which is already taking place, then we do need to invest about 2.6 billion euros by 2030. However, we are going to save by 2030 over 3 billion euros. And not all of this will necessarily have to be, of course, paid by the owners, but we'll come back to that. Nevertheless, if we go for a suboptimal scenario, then in fact we will need to invest much more, and it doesn't necessarily even pay back, at least not by 2030. And after 2030, the building sector is done in this scenario. So basically, any savings goes back to the people's pockets and will stay with the investors. So basically, we could interpret this as a free lunch. And of course, for you, that's probably a strange thing to consider since you're actually doing this work. But from a climate change mitigation perspective, it's important to show that there aren't only costs, but actually you're going to get that money back. But the reason why, I'm sure you know the joke about the economist and his daughter who are walking on the street, and the daughter says, "Daddy, there is a $20 bill on the pavement." And the economist said, "No, honey, it's not possible. You know, if there had been a $20 bill on the pavement, somebody would have already have picked it up." So there is this eternal debate whether there are free lunches or not. And it's true that it's not an easy free lunch to get, because imagine this free lunch, that the way you get this free lunch, that when you get into the restaurant, you have to pay a cover charge, which actually pays for all your lunches for the next 30 years or perhaps 40 years. And then for the next 40 years, whenever you come back and have actually lunch, then you are paid for your lunch. You get back the price that you paid for that particular lunch. So that, you know, if you were offered that kind of a free lunch arrangement, I'm not sure if all of you would take it. But so there is this, minor caveat with the free lunch. But beyond just the financial benefit, there are many other benefits, there are many other carrots why we should go for this really complex renovation of our building stock and this paradigm change, how we are thinking about buildings and how the whole East European building stock looks like and what it is right now. And this perhaps will help us more in getting this job done than either the climate change talk or even the energy efficiency and financial savings benefits, since that hasn't really helped the case for so many decades in the world. But in fact, what we need to understand that in most new member states, and especially in the age of the financial crisis, which we still live through, many countries are already through, but we are still in the midst, at least some of our countries, unlike Poland and so on. Energy efficiency, primarily, it's not a green agenda. It is a social and an economic agenda. And if we had understood that better, we could get further. For example, fuel poverty. This is a concept that we haven't talked about for almost at all, whereas our much richer neighbors or colleagues in Western Europe, such as the United Kingdom of Ireland, have been focusing on this for many decades already. But fuel poverty is clearly much worse in Central and Eastern Europe than in their countries. But we just haven't really looked at it. Only recently we are trying to look. The Central European University has recently released a study, the author of which is also here, Sergio Tirado, in this audience, about the level of fuel poverty in Hungary. And according to the study, approximately 2,000 to 2,500 lives are lost in Hungary alone each year as a result of fuel poverty. And you shouldn't imagine people, homeless people freezing to death on the streets. That's not what we are talking about. But people who just cannot afford adequate heating. The WHO recommendations are that you have your living room at 21 degrees and every other room where you unoccupied still at approximately 19 degrees. If you have lower than this, then you're much more prone and much more vulnerable to different illnesses, which at the end of the day will cost some lives. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to quantify yet morbidity. This means that a lot of children, mainly those of poorer households, are much more sick much more from flu or cold. They are away from school more. It affects their school performance, perhaps their whole lifetime prospect. If we apply the UK definition, which is that if you spend more than 10% of your income on energy cost, then you are fuel poor. If you use this definition, then actually 80%, roughly 80% of Hungarian households are fuel poor, because at the end of 2007, 10.4% was the average that the Hungarian household spent on energy bills. Now, since 2007, that was the last time the data were available for, this situation probably has much worsened due to the crisis and energy price increases. Also, about 1.5 million Hungarians declare that they cannot afford to keep their homes sufficiently heated. Now, there are many ways to try to solve the problem. You can throw a lot of subsidies, and that's what we've been doing for decades. But in fact, the result of that is just you just lock these people into this poverty, because then they will have absolutely no incentive to try to solve the situation, and whenever you are weaning them from any support, they will be in much worse shape. So if we had retrofitted our building stock in a deep way, so with a complex renovation program, this could basically eliminate fuel poverty in Eastern Europe. And that's clearly a very important agenda item in this region. But let's look at other carrots, or why else we should go for a significant improvement in the energy consumption of our existing buildings. And let's just, I just collected a few examples. We have done a study for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also for the Global Energy Assessment on collecting these co-benefits. We talk about them a lot, but we rarely quantify them. We rarely understand that we are actually not talking about small figures, but in fact we are talking about sometimes tens or even hundreds of billions of US dollar worth of savings, not in Hungary, but in the United States. So let's see a couple of examples which are the results of financial savings as a result of more energy efficient buildings. Studies show that in a renovated in a high efficiency building which is performing well, labor productivity actually can raise by between 6 to 16%. Students' productivity as well, their stats scores showed a 20 to 26 increase and also faster learning as a result of better daylighting. Daylighting is very important for that. The big savings come from the reduced illnesses, such as influenza and cold. If you have a well-ventilated building, this can decrease influenza and cold rates by as much as 20%, clearly very important for employers in productivity. And unfortunately, most of the co-benefits calculations were done in the United States, so my examples will be from there. So this can result in an approximately $10 billion savings in the United States alone. For example, if you have some more concrete things, if you have a better indoor environment, which resulted from an energy efficient retrofit, then you can save $6 to $14 billion a year in reduced respiratory disease. $1 to $4 billion in terms of the reduced allergies and asthma incidence. 10 to $30 billion as a result of the reduced sick building syndrome. And finally, $20 to $160 billion a year in direct improvements in worker performance, not related to health, just productivity increases. So we are not talking about small issues, and that's one of our problems. You know, we are not enough competitive in these countries sometimes, and so we could definitely use these savings for many things. Another example that I haven't got in here, but since I have a bit of a time, let me just talk about energy security. Yesterday, for the Hungarian audience, I presented some of our initial findings. The same kind of renovation of just the Hungarian building stock could reduce our natural gas imports by 40%. So that significantly improves also energy security. But finally, a very important item, which is very high priority in all of Europe, but especially in this region. Hungary has the lowest activity rate in the whole European Union. So employment and job creation is very important. A Danish study found that if you look at different climate change mitigation options, then renovation and buildings-related energy efficiency has twice higher employment intensity than other mitigation options. So if you need to choose between your mitigation options. We are doing another study funded by the European Climate Foundation on how much employment would be created by a wide-scale renovation program in Hungary if we retrofitted basically the whole Hungarian building stock in a deep way, so close to passive house standards. And what we are finding, our numbers are also not final yet. We are finalizing the study in 2 months. But our initial figures, which are also already quite robust in their own sense, show that about 250,000 net jobs can be created just by this program alone. And if you think about it, that's really quite a significant number, since the European Union expects that this whole 2020 package will create roughly 1 million new jobs in Europe. I'm not sure how that number was arrived at, but only one program just in buildings renovation can arrive at 250,000 jobs. And this is how this net impact is calculated, or not calculated, but this is how it looks like. The two bars you see, one is, the lower bar is if we do a suboptimal renovation program. So basically, if you just keep continuing with 20, 30, 40% renovations, energy savings in renovation, and we accelerate it a bit, but not at the level as in this scenario. Then we create about 150,000 direct jobs. So these are the jobs in the construction industry. But we usually forget about the indirect impacts, and that's also very important. We are talking about another roughly 150,000 jobs. We also have to acknowledge that we are losing jobs also in the energy industry. So that's taken into account, and the blue lines indicate the net job gains that we are seeing. And in this, we have not yet calculated the induced effects, although we are going to still refine these numbers and take on board many comments that we've received. So we will watch out for our final numbers at the end of June. But basically, the point is that we are looking at significant impacts. What does this mean for the industry? These are the investments that will have to be made in this regard. And what you see is that we're talking about perhaps between 4 to 6 billion euros a year investments for the next 10, 25 years, depending on which scenario you choose. The bottom one is kind of the business as usual. The yellow one is the suboptimal scenario. And the two upper ones, in all of these, we actually retrofit the buildings to passive standards, but at a different dynamic. So different number of buildings per year. So this is a tremendous business opportunity for all the green building councils in Eastern Europe. These are just Hungarian figures. I'm sure the figures in your country will be similar. So, yeah, but you're asking, oh, well, that sounds nice, but actually who will pay for it? Now, I think there is a lot of money out there that can be used for this purpose. Clearly not necessarily those of the people, of the owners, because the owners don't have the money, and most of them are not creditworthy. However, there is a lot of funding, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into those details. However, we should understand that there is an enormous amount of EU money coming into the region, and this is a one-time opportunity. There is not a lot of, the window is not open for too many more years. It's just a few more years that opportunity is still open. And whereas we have basically spent very little of the EU structural funds on buildings or even energy efficiency in total, and that's very disappointing. Less than 0.5% went so far for energy efficiency in total. Now the EU has raised and eliminated all the different barriers. Now you can use these funds for renovating buildings, not only social buildings, and you can do it up to 4% of national funds for available in general from these funds. But we all have to make sure that this happens. The same, there is a lot of AAU sales, different emission quota sales, ETS auctioning revenues. So the carbon market is also generating a lot of funds, most of which has to be invested in relation to climate change mitigation. Now, where else would it generate all these other societal benefits than buildings renovation? This is clearly, in my view, that's the most attractive option. But presently, this is not where it's going. If some of you, you mentioned Copenhagen, I was quite shocked in Copenhagen that on the rhetorical level, everyone starts, yes, energy efficiency, energy efficiency. But when you went to Copenhagen, hardly anything was on buildings and energy efficiency. That was so much on the bottom of the agenda. All the big sexy technologies, carbon capture and storage, and all these behind which there are big, strong industries. Well, where is your industry? Why isn't your voice heard much more? We need to have your voice heard much, much more. So the Green Building Councils have tremendous importance in letting this message out much more, that this is very, very important. But you can actually, you don't have to subsidize it all. Also, people can pay for it from the energy savings through various innovative financing schemes, and there are very good examples out there, and I don't have time to go into that. So, in conclusion, let me just offer what I think could be the priorities for Green Building Councils in Eastern Europe based on these messages that I've given you. So first of all, we need to be very clever in demonstrating that very high performance, very green buildings are not necessarily expensive. In fact, many times they are cheaper. And that was voiced yesterday and this morning by Jerry and by many of you. But let's make it seen more so that people don't have the perception, green, expensive, sorry, I can't afford it. So we need to demonstrate it much more. It needs to become a mainstream rather than a luxury market. Presently, it is very much a luxury market. Also, it's important to focus much more on renovation. Again, this is not sexy, and previously we just considered renovation. That's not, why should it be related to green building councils? It's, you know, the window industry, insulation. No, we are talking about complex renovations, and it's very much the job of the green building councils. As I pointed out, because of the lock-in effect, it's very important to go for deep, complex, state-of-the-art renovations and do not compromise for suboptimal solutions. Supporting suboptimal renovation is worse than doing nothing. Because if you do nothing, perhaps once you have the funding, you have the mechanism, you're able to do it, you will retrofit in a major way. What I also pointed out, there is lots of financing available, but the Green Building Councils need to have a much stronger voice in letting the decision makers and governments know that this is really a very high priority from a societal, financial, and economic perspective and climate perspective, that the money is, first of all, the money is spent on this, and then the money is spent. Because another problem is that many times we don't even, it's actually not an easy thing to spend money. For example, in the green investment schemes, when we were designing it, and some of you may be working on this, yes, you suddenly have, you know, this many billions to spend. How do you spend it quickly but effectively? It's not an easy task. In terms of adaptation and mitigation, it is very important to already start building now the heat resistant buildings. Now it's not that bad. We have mainly optimized buildings for heating, but in fact this will change, and we have to look at cooling as well. We have to try to prevent air conditioning loads and needs and integrate as much greenery into urban areas and buildings as possible. So finally, no, there was one more in this which I didn't put on, capacity building. And then just a joke, how many lead consultants does it take to change a light bulb? I'm sure many of you know this. 4. because one of them, calculates how many lead points you can earn. One to run to the GBC to actually plan and submit the proposal. One to actually change the light bulb, and one who will go back and check whether you really earned as many points as you claim. So we need to create enormous amount of capacity, 4 persons for every light bulb. But in reality, the job is enormous because we have to retrain most of our architects, most of the construction industry, and the challenge is huge. So finally, the challenge is huge, and it's your and my mission to make these opportunities reality, but not like this. How many green building consultants does it take to change a light bulb? Not LEED, just general green building consultants. None. Someone else did it. I'm sorry, I was at the conference. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention.